So many people have noted that the current cultural societal structure seems to be facing all sorts of problems. These problems have been characterized by some people as a meta crisis, in that there are a multiplicity of different difficulties that society is facing writ large, and they intersect in a way to create a potentially catastrophic vulnerability, such that if we do not shift fundamentally our way of relating to each other, our technologies, and the planet, we may be facing global civilization collapse, and at the very least, facing massive amounts of distress, dysfunction, and difficulty relative to our potential. There are a number of different aspects of this meta crisis, and I would like to list four that provide at least a framing for what we are facing. So one can be framed in relationship to as the techno-environmental crisis. The techno-environmental crisis refers to the fact that the explosion of the industrial age across the planet and the way in which we then manufactured human technology on top of the planet created a massive vulnerability and fundamental flux within the Earth's ecology writ large and in many specific locations. The press that we put on the environment is very vulnerable to disrupting the general systemic sustainability of the Earth's ecology. That then is most obvious in terms of climate change, in terms of the global structures. It's also very obvious in terms of press on local populations, the great extinction, and the massive amounts of transformation that humans are doing, so that geologists identify this as a new era called the Anthropocene, resulting in so much shift that if that change does not get stabilized, it creates massive amounts of fluctuation, such that the back half of the 21st century may literally result in a planet that is barely livable. So there's a techno-environmental crisis. Okay. There's also an unbelievable transformation in the way we're living in the world. The digital world has exploded onto the scene and is changing the institutional infrastructure for virtually everything. And that institutional infrastructure then is in the process of an enormous amount of flux, of which we see many different potentials for virtual metaverse and many different dangers of a virtual metaverse. And that is undermining and creating change in the old institutional structures in a way that is, well, filled with both pitfalls and potentials. And there's an enormous amount of uncertainty upon which the digital globalization process will unfold, and whether it will be organized in a way that reveals and cultivates human potential, or whether it will be transformative either into a destructive chaos or into some sort of technological nightmare, and a sort of George Orwellian 1984 techno-social control system that imprisons us all. So the digital globalization and the techno-environmental crises reflect the large-scale human relationship with the planet, the evolution of technology and interface, and the demands that puts on the planet, and the questions that it raises in relationship to our relations with each other. But these aren't the only meta-crises. There are at least two other major lines, one of which can be framed in relationship to the meaning crisis. The meaning crisis refers to the knowledge systems and their organization, and can be summarized in the sense that we have lost a shared sense, or never had at this level of abstraction, a fundamental shared sense of what is true and good. Instead, the current structure of our understanding can be characterized as a chaotic, fragmented pluralism, such that we are overloaded with perspectives and information and possibilities, and the generalized knowledge structure of our understanding lacks any coherent, integrated framework that affords us the capacity, either at a process level or a knowledge content level, that would enable effective sense-making and the coordination of our understanding around what is true and what ought to be good. And thus the dissemination of information absent a particular shared set of understanding is essentially overloading the system with chaos. And that means overloading the system with the inability to coordinate activity, understanding, and sense-making with any kind of shared reality. And the absence of that leads to craziness. It also leads to an enormous difficulty with our education structures, because the intergenerational transmission of knowledge and the legitimacy of elders to children and the ability to socialize them into the system is now breaking down completely. Indeed, Zach Stein identifies this educational intergenerational problem, where you confer the legitimacy of shared meaning amongst the elders to the young, and that obliteration of that is at the fundamental center of the core of the problems that we face. And the chaotic fragmented pluralism that has engendered our knowledge structures, flooding us with uncertainty, is then generating also a mental health crisis. The mental health crisis is seen very clearly in the fact that despite our physical and biological control over the world, our felt sense of being in the world is now characterized by levels of depression, anxiety, substance use, suicidality, isolation, loneliness, alienation, nihilism, narcissism, and a fundamental sense of meaninglessness that generates existential crises across populations writ large. And these elements are tragic beyond stating, in the sense that we have all sorts of potential opportunity to flourish, given our power, and yet we are floundering. And the intersection of all of this, how are we going to coordinate our technologies in relationship to nature and each other? How are we going to manage the evolution of the digital, all its potentials and pitfalls? UTOK is going on with the meaning crisis and the chaotic fragmented pluralism that's driving everybody insane, showing up in terms of the mental health crisis and situating us so that we are unable to effectively coordinate our action toward wisdom. UTOK has something to say. UTOK fundamentally has something to say about the meaning crisis. It diagnoses the fundamental structure, the architecture of our knowledge systems that emerged in the context of the Enlightenment, and demonstrates why they were entirely inadequate to afford us a coherent, integrated framework that would allow for the multiplicity of perspectives to be engendered as such, meaning they are multiplicity of perspectives, and yet at the same time to position them into and in relationship to something that's coherent and integrated. And the reason it could not do that is because the emergence of modern empirical natural science was associated with philosophical developments that broke synthetic understanding. And the reason it broke in synthetic understanding is because the systems that were developed were never able to place in proper relation the matter in motion framework that emerged so unbelievably powerful with the physical sciences, with the qualitative experience of subjective being and the nature of mind itself. So we have a conundrum of profound proportions failing to specify the proper relation of matter and mind. In addition, the power of scientific knowledge and reason to lead to transcendental truths was also not effectively contextualized with the social construction of knowledge and subjective experience of being, and not placed in a pragmatic social cultural context, which gives rise to the post-structural and postmodern critique of modernity that says all of your transcendent justifications towards reason and individual rationality and progress actually situate themselves in a way that biases power structures and marginalizes weak and oppressed individuals and creates a massive imbalance of power that then is justified through reason and progress, creating a fundamental error in the organization of our society, one that's profoundly unjust and profoundly questions the capacity to achieve any kind of transcendent knowing. The combination of the failure of matter and motion to be corresponded with subjective mind and the failure of clarifying the nature of scientific knowledge in relationship to the social construction and subjective experience of knowledge, all has spread the ground of confusion that spawns the current chaotic fragmented pluralism when we are overloaded with fragmented bits of information and mid-level theories that cannot be coordinated. UTOK diagnoses the enlightenment gap, affords a meta-modern sensibility, meaning that we can embrace the realistic scientific achievements and at the same time effectively situate them in the social construction of knowledge and position objectively generated scientific behavioral truths with the fundamental experience of psychic organization at the level of the ideographic subject. And it affords for the first time the opportunity to synthesize these perspectives, bridge the enlightenment gap, and does so with a level of specification around the center of the enlightenment gap, which is found in the problem of psychology and psychotherapy. And what UTOK fundamentally is about is demonstrating the possibility of a coherent science of psychology and its focus on human mental behavior with the work of psychotherapy and the contextualized individual psyche. The capacity to bridge those particular structures has never been engendered before, but it is engendered now. And thus, we can move by diagnosing the epicenter of the problem that gave rise to the chaotic fragmented pluralism into a coherent integrated pluralism that bridges and resolves the enlightenment gap, solves the problem of psychology and psychotherapy, and affords us a way to cultivate knowledge oriented toward wisdom.